Well, as we have heard today, Justice Ottman has identified the United States as one of the 3 UN member states, along with the UK and South Africa, most likely to hold records relating to the crash of Hammarskjöld's plane in its intelligence, security and defence archives. He asked the US to appoint an independent and high-ranking appointee to survey and review these records. This was done. 3 appointees have been designated in turn, though none of them was independent of government, and I think we see a pattern here. In any case, the process thus far has been fruitless. In 2022, the Justice reported that, I quote, other than 1 document in 2019 and 2 documents in 2021, which were publicly available and contained no information, nothing additional as material was provided by the United States between mid-2017 and 2022, and my outstanding queries have not been responded to. This failure to cooperate can be seen, as we heard earlier today, as consistent with the decision of the US not to co-sponsor the recent General Assembly resolution authorising the continuation of Justice Ottman's investigation. This made the US, like the UK, a global outlier, for the resolution, as we have heard, was co-sponsored by 142 member states out of 193. The lack of support by the US for Justice Ottman's investigation is perhaps especially disturbing because 4 Americans, 1/4 of the 16 victims, perished as a result of the crash. This has seldom been noted. As a mark of respect, I say their names: Vladimir Fabry, legal advisor to the UN operation in the Congo; Sergeant Harold and Julian, acting chief security officer; William Ramelow, bodyguard and personal aide to Hammarskjöld; and Heinrich A. Bischoff, a key advisor to Hammarskjöld. And we heard some important comments by his son earlier today. And one of these 4 Americans was the only person still breathing when the rescue team finally arrived. This was Harry Julian, a former Marine now in his 30s, who had served in Korea. You will see Julian in this photo, taken just days before the crash. Thank you. The photo, there we are. At the airport of Leopoldville, now Kinshasa, of course. Hammarskjöld, second from the right, has just arrived, and Julian is at the far left of the group, carrying a bag. One can only imagine the intensity of Julian's suffering. No help of any sort was sent to the site between the crash, shortly after midnight, and about 3:10 p.m. Julian lay in agony for about 15 hours, with 50% burns, a partial fracture of the skull, and a dislocated ankle. After dawn, he was at the mercy of the blazing sun, at a time of year when the heat reaches 91 degrees Fahrenheit. These long hours of pain are all the more shocking since a mass of evidence has emerged to show that various people, a number of people, knew the plane had crashed and where many hours before 3:10 p.m. These include a number of British colonial officials. And local charcoal burners discovered the wreckage in the early hours and rushed to tell Timothy Kankatha, then board secretary of the nearby township, who went on to become a minister of state after Zambia's independence from Britain in 1964. And we heard the recollections of his wife, Mama Chibesa Kankatha, earlier today. Kankatha contacted the colonial authorities, but no assistance or ambulances were sent. There were no police at all, no police, no one from the army, nobody at all until the afternoon, explained Kankatha. He was appalled. We could not understand why they did not respond. Julian's wife, Maria, reached his bedside in Ndola on 22 September after the long journey from her home in Miami. She was in deep shock and distress. She too had served in the UN, which is how she and Julian met. It is to be hoped she was not exposed to the vicious hatred of the UN that was displayed by many white Rhodesians. Maria Julian found herself in the British colonial territory of Northern Rhodesia, which was strictly organised on the basis of racial inequality and segregation, not unlike apartheid South Africa. And her husband was in a hospital for so-called Europeans. The so-called African hospital was a converted horse stable and barn with rudimentary conditions. Julian was expected to survive, but he died after 5 days, on the day after Maria's arrival. In the last hour of his life, according to a nurse who was present, he pleaded with Maria, "Honey, take me home. We must get out of here quickly. You will take me home." Mrs. Julian tried to reassure him, but Julian never made it back to Miami. Julian's son Richard told me that after his mother returned to the US, she told her sister that Julian had said there were 3 explosions on the plane in the last minutes of the flight. This fits with Julian's statement to a Northern Rhodesian police inspector that the plane blew up. There was great speed, then there was the crash. One of Julian's nurses heard him refer to sparks in the sky. These statements match many of the testimonies of people on the ground. However, the Rhodesian Commission of Inquiry dismissed them as rambling. In 2019, new information was given to Justice Ottman about Julian's stay in hospital. It was provided by the government of Zimbabwe, which, unlike the US, UK and South Africa, has worked strenuously to search for relevant documentation to assist the justice. This evidence reveals that the Rhodesian authorities proactively sought to prevent Julian's statements from being made public. A Rhodesian intelligence official warned one of Julian's doctors that no one of his hospital staff must talk about this, including Julian's statement that he had seen sparks in the sky. The justice regards this evidence as significant. In his view, a general undervaluing of the evidence of Harold Julian may have affected the exhaustiveness of the earlier inquiry's consideration of the possible hypotheses. It also suggests that Julian may have said more about the last moments of the crash than is yet available. One wonders if the US independent appointees searched for all the reports sent to Washington by the US resident consul in Lusaka, the capital of Northern Rhodesia, who rushed to Ndola after the crash and visited Julian each day. The resident consul assisted in transmissions to Elizabethville, now Lubumbashi, Leopoldville and Washington, and was in close communication with the US Consul General in Salisbury, now Harare, the capital of Southern Rhodesia, who was also communicating with Washington. All this paperwork needs to be made available to Justice Ottman. There were many missed opportunities to care successfully for Julian. Mark Lowenthal, a doctor on his medical team, could not understand why he was not taken to the US. He said, "Julian was a strong young man, and with the best that modern care of the time could offer, would have survived. I was inexperienced, 4 years out of medical school, and not in charge of the case. A mature me would have unofficially told the Americans to send an aircraft to take him to the US quickly. The matter remains with me," he said, "as a great regret." But the US did not need to send an aircraft. There were already 3 US transport planes, DC-3s, parked at Ndola Airport. And they arrived at Ndola during the period of between the period of September 15th to 18th, 1961, and of course the crash took place on the night of 17th to 18th. Before I give an account of these US planes, I'd like briefly to draw a picture of the scene on the tarmac at Ndola Airport. In September 1961, there were 18 Royal Rhodesia Air Force planes parked there, Vampire jets and Canberra bombers. A key reason was the freedom struggle against white minority rule. And this struggle, which was known as the Cha-Cha-Cha, was ruthlessly repressed by the white settler government, which hoped to secure white supremacy for long into the future. And in the words of a journalist from the UK Guardian who was on the scene, the place was humming. The 3 US DC-3s, therefore, landed in a highly charged environment. One of the pilots was Commander Don L. Ely, the US Naval Attaché for Air in Pretoria, South Africa. He and his crew reached Ndola on September 16th and left on the 18th. It is not possible to establish why Ely was there. He gave a brief testimony to the Rhodesian investigation, affirming that he had no knowledge of the plans for Hammarskjöld's plane and that his aircraft was never in contact with it during its last flight. It has not been possible to find out much about Ely, except that he was in naval intelligence and that he had previously been US Naval Attaché for Air to Iran. Another DC-3 was flown to Ndola by Colonel Benjamin Matlick, the US Air Attaché in Libya. He was in Elizabethville at the time of the crash and reached Ndola around noon next day. He sought to assist with the search for the wreckage, apparently. And the third DC-3 at Ndola Airport was commanded by Colonel Don G. Gaylor, the US Air Force air attaché, whose function was intelligence gathering in sub-Saharan Africa. Like Ely, he was stationed in Pretoria. He was sent to Ndola by the Pentagon and arrived on September 15th. He later said that his mission was, quote, to meet Hammarskjöld and offer my assistance and transportation, if he so desired, end of quote. But this runs counter to UK official records, which show that the arrangement of Hammarskjöld's meeting in Ndola was not even being discussed by the Secretary General on the 15th of September. According to his memoir and a letter he wrote in 1994, Gaylor was in the control tower at Ndola Airport on the night of the crash, waiting for Hammarskjöld's aircraft. After the plane failed to arrive, said Gaylor, he took to the air at first light to look for a possible crash site, using calculations he had prepared earlier. Gaylor wrote that he spotted the wreckage shortly after dawn and immediately contacted rescue services. He enclosed an aerial photograph of the crash site with his letter. You will note my aircraft shadow, he wrote, as the hour was not long after dawn and the sun was still low on the horizon. However, there is a discrepancy between this claim and other sources. Moreover, an expert has recently analysed the photo and determined that the most likely time it was taken was around 2 to 3 p.m. Without further information, these discrepancies cannot be resolved. The justice needs to see the report that Gaylor said he sent to the Pentagon. Gaylor said, my report to my superiors in the Pentagon was acknowledged with some accolades. In 2016, Justice Ottman asked the US for information on US aircraft at Ndola on the night of the crash, and he was told that USAF did not have any records. Presumably then, the US had not searched the records of the Pentagon, State Department, Defense Intelligence Agency, National Security Agency, CIA, or any other relevant government department. The judge asked for clarification, and in 2017 was informed that 3 aircraft were there during that short period. However, it said that 2 of them went to Ndola from Elizabethville on 18 September. This was not the case. We have documents showing that both Gaylor's and Ely's aircraft arrived before the crash. Only Macklin's aircraft arrived on the 18th. After Hammarskjöld's plane failed to land, a team of Norwegian UN soldiers flew to Ndola to assist in the search. Because of White Rhodesians' hostility to UN personnel, they were not allowed to enter the airport terminal. So the crew of one of the DC-3s invited them on board to get some food. And to the surprise of the UN soldiers, they saw that the American plane was packed with sophisticated radio equipment. It was presumably one of these DC-3s with which the US Embassy in Leopoldville was communicating with Ndola. And this may help to explain the fact that Edmund A. Gullion, the US ambassador in Leopoldville, sent a cable to Washington just hours after the crash that referred to the possibility that the plane was shot down. Hammarskjöld's plane believed lost in vicinity Rhodesian border near Ndola, the cable reads. There is possibility he was shot down by a single pilot who has harassed UN operations and who has been identified by one usually reliable source as Van Rissegem, Belgium, who accepted training mission with so-called Katangam Air Force, and this picks up with what Dr. O'Malley said this morning. That hypothesis is bolstered by the statements of Commander Charles Southall, an American naval pilot working at the NSA listening station in Cyprus in 1961. Shortly after midnight on September 18th, he said, he and some other officers heard a recording of intercepted radio communications. According to Southall, they heard the noise of an aircraft engine and the commentary of the pilot. I see a transport plane coming low. All the lights are on. I'm going down to make a run on it. Yes, it is the Transair DC-6. It's the plane. The pilot's voice was cool and professional, said Southall. Then they heard gun cannons firing and the pilot saying, I've hit it. There are flames. It's going down. It's crashing. Southall said he had the impression that the pilot was expecting the plane. He suspected that the pilot was communicating with the CIA or with some other Katangam, Rhodesian, or British base that was cooperating with the CIA. If the CIA didn't order Hammarskjöld's death, concluded Southall, at least they paid for the bullet. I just mentioned here that Southall said he couldn't remember if the recording was in English or French because he spoke both languages fluently, but he thought if he were to make any selection, it would be French. That fits with what Roland has shared with us. And separately from Southall's claim, a USAF Security Services officer working at the NSA listening post on Crete claimed that he heard an intercept in real time of an attack on a plane in or near the Congo on the same night. The Justice asked the US for information on this officer, Paul Abraham, but for 2 years was told by the US that it did not have information on him. This position was challenged by the Justice on the grounds that such information was publicly available. Finally, in 2017, the US sent information about Abraham's service record, including his specialization as Voice Intercept Protocol Specialist. This pattern was similar in the case of Commander Southall. The US confirmed to the Justice that he was in the Navy in 1961, but not whether he was stationed in Cyprus or worked in support of the NSA. The claims made by Southall and Abraham are germane to the question of whether Hammarskjöld's plane may have been subjected to some kind of attack, so they remain an area of interest, and both men insisted that the NSA should hold a tape of the recording they heard. When Hammarskjöld was appointed Secretary General in 1953, he was appalled to discover, as Dr. Lipsey said earlier, that the FBI had an office at UN headquarters in New York and was screening American UN personnel. Hammarskjöld swiftly ejected the FBI, but he had no idea of an even more intrusive form of US spying on the UN. In 2020, the Washington Post revealed it had obtained a classified CIA history of an operation involving crypto CX52 cipher machines, such as encrypted messages could be decoded with relative ease by American intelligence agencies. More than 120 countries use this equipment, and so did the UN. This meant that when Hammarskjöld and his mission went to the Congo, all their top-secret encrypted cable traffic was available to the NSA and the CIA. And there were 2 CX-52s on the plane that crashed near Ndola, and we have pictures that were taken of them after the crash. Justice Ottman has asked the US to comment on the allegation that transmissions from Hammarskjöld's cipher machines were intercepted by the US, but the response was unhelpful, that the US has no comments on this item. The Justice has also noticed the existence of records referring to the interception of UN communications, which the Rhodesian and British authorities were apparently able to decode. These appear to have been shared with the US in at least some cases. The Justice has asked for information on this issue, but again, the US responded that it has no comment to make. Knut Hammarskjöld, Dag Hammarskjöld's nephew, went to Ndola after the crash to represent his family in their grief. While there, he became suspicious, as we heard earlier, of what was going on. He told me that he spoke about this in later years with Senator Frank Church, the US Senator who in 1975 chaired the Senate committee investigating the abuses of US intelligence activities. Knut asked Senator Church if he knew anything about Hammarskjöld's death, and he was disturbed by the senator's answer. We have a lot on this, but we can't make it public. The records of the work of the Church Committee in 1975 are covered by the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992, which has led to the release of a vast number of records. These include new information relating to the operations of the CIA in the Congo in the 1960s, but many of these files are heavily redacted. In some cases, files of nearly 200 pages have been redacted so extensively that almost all the pages are blank. And many files were held back in the most recent release under the JFK Act of 1992, which took place in December 2022, the most recent release. These may include some references to the Hammarskjöld crash. It's impossible to know unless we see them. The federal judge handling a case seeking to enforce the Act has kept alive legal claims for an accounting of Church Committee documents. This case is currently being litigated in the US District Court of Northern California. There is hope that more information from the Church Committee will be released as a result of this litigation. Otherwise, further releases will be in accordance with so-called transparency plans written by the CIA. Among the files that were released is one revealing that the South Africa-based mercenary Mike Hall worked for the CIA in Central Africa from at least 1964. Hall was most likely a CIA asset earlier than 1964, since he was already being referred to in this file by a CIA cryptonym, Sekharov-1, and his wife Phyllis as Sekharov-2. A State Department cable from 1961 refers to Hall as a trusted authority on events in Katanga. And in August 1961, Hall was scheming to offer the Katanga forces a unit of hand-picked men to fight against the UN. In another file of newly released Church Committee records, there is a summary of an interview with Larry Devlin, CIA Chief of Station in the Congo from 1960, in which Devlin said he had important contact with Hall and his men. Well, these references to Hall are intriguing because he and his new wife Phyllis were in Andola on the night of the crash of Hammarskjöld's plane. This emerged from a book by his son Chris, who records that Michael and Phyllis married in June 1961 and were in Katanga in July, having a honeymoon in a war zone. They then returned to South Africa. In September, he and Phyllis went back to Katanga by road, and on their way, they were in a hotel in Andola on the night of the crash. And according to Chris Hall's book, his father, and I quote here, felt that the real cause of the crash had been covered up and would never come out. He made it clear he personally knew nothing about the crash and had had nothing to do with the crash. But it remains important, states Justice Ottman, for records relating to Hall to be disclosed by the US government. It is possible too that South Africa holds records of interest here. Nothing in the reports submitted by Justice Ottman to the UN Secretary General has ever suggested that the US or any UN member state was responsible for or even involved in the crash of Hammarskjöld's plane. Rather, the past and ongoing efforts have been directed to obtain the disclosure of information in light of the assessment the Justice has made that it is almost certain that a few key member states, including the US, hold relevant undisclosed information. And without this information, the investigation cannot be properly concluded. Searching for this information is a responsibility owed by the US government, not only to the UN, but also to the loved ones, the families of those 4 Americans, Vladimir Favre, Harold Julian, Bill Ramelow, and Heinrich Bischoff, whose lives were tragically cut short in the course of their heroic service to the UN and to peace.